who says they are in trouble just because somebody resigned. Let's put it into perspective for 1 second for your listeners. At the end of the day, in the election, the Conservatives won more seats and more share of the vote than any other party. Labour seems to think that they won the election and have the right to go to Brussels and be a de facto in waiting government in case everything collapses with Theresa May. Now, I want to put you and James O'Brien straight.
Okay, I'll be sure to pass it on to him.
Make sure you do, because obviously some people choose to, for some reasons unknown to anybody else, want to ignore the vote and think of this as everything is in trouble, that the world is going to end if Britain is no longer in the European Union. Well, let me put you straight. For hundreds of years, this country has survived perfectly well without the need to piggyback on some European super state. And for you and your colleague to imply that for some reason we had a vote and now we want to know exactly what's going to happen when we leave and, you know, the mechanisms and the mechanics of it all. Get real. This is happening. Whether you like it or not, the mechanics are inconsequential to anything people do in life. If I cross the road, I have to decide if I'm going to make it or if a bus is going to run me over. That's the reality, Sheila.
Okay.
Get over it.
Okay, right. Can I say something back to you?
Absolutely.
I don't believe the world will end, even if we go out with a hard Brexit with not a single deal under our belt. I don't believe that Britain will go to the dogs on a permanent basis if we leave the European Union either, because you are right to say that we have survived as a great nation during many phases of our existence. So I don't believe either of those two things. But I do believe that there is a constructive way to do Brexit and a destructive way to do Brexit. And the destructive way is the one that asks no questions and walks out the door.
Well, I'm sorry, Sheila. What you're doing is undermining every move of this Conservative government and looking for any mechanism in which to suggest that the government is falling to pieces.
Doug.
It's not happening.
Doug, two cabinet ministers lost within a week.
So what?
Hang on a second. Let me finish my list of problems that the government faces at the moment.
Yeah, all you have is a list of problems, Sheila. You're very negative. Very negative.
It's the job of journalists to look at problems and ask about them.
Someone who's not happy with the vote.
Are you always this angry when you have conversations?
Yes, I am, especially with people like you.
Oh, well, there you go. 1-0 to...
Multiculturalism has failed. I believe that. Now, put the oath thing aside for a moment and let's look at the substance, because I think that the oaths and, you know, hoo-has around symbolism and nationalism are largely symbolic. But multiculturalism has failed. It has. And, you know, people on my end of the political spectrum, those who like to consider themselves liberals, and regular listeners will know that I've begun to differentiate between the left and the liberals, because a lot of the far left are no longer liberal. But nevertheless, for the purposes of this conversation, let's look at the left and the liberals, who, rightly so, by the way, sneer at British expats abroad who travel to foreign countries and form isolated, ghettoised communities and end up becoming more British than the British because of the way in which they don't acclimatise to the local culture, they don't learn the languages of the local culture, and they make absolutely zero attempt to integrate. In fact, I laughed very hard once upon a time at a Goodness Gracious Me sketch where the British Indian family went to India and was sitting in a restaurant and said, "Bring me," to the waiter, who was this perfectly reasonable English gentleman. It was a reverse of, if you're getting the role play here, it's all reversed. And they said, he said, can I, it was in an English restaurant in India. And the joke was, bring us the blandest dish on the menu. And often it is the case that British expats don't integrate when they're abroad, and liberals and those on the left sneer at such behaviour. And for the life of me, I can't understand that when that behaviour, when that isolationism, when that ghettoisation is repeated within our own country by communities that live among us, somehow it's racist to criticize that or to talk about it. So let's put aside the oath for a minute, because I often say on this show that the facts speak for themselves. And if we genuinely don't want to reside in a post-truth, post-fact society, then that applies as much as it does to the populist right as it does to the left. So let's hear the facts and tell me what you think, whether multiculturalism has succeeded or not. Before I read out to you some of these facts, I just want to say something. The first victims of the failure to integrate in this society are the very minority communities that those on the left claim they wanted to support. Their refusal to challenge some behaviour and some practices that go on within my own community has ended up in creating, through the lack of integration, a lack of social mobility, a lack of success within those very same communities that they claimed to want to be helping. The first victims of a lack of integration are the minority communities themselves. So let's put that at the forefront of our minds before we proceed, because what you're about to hear is a progressive critique of the failure of multiculturalism. You're about to hear a liberal critique of the failure of multiculturalism. It can be done, and the way it can be done is by putting the interests of the minority communities first. And if minority communities are falling behind due to a government policy of the 90s known as multiculturalism, then the government has failed minority communities. And there is the liberal critique of multiculturalism. Muslims out of those minority communities are the ones suffering the most out of everyone. So now let's hear the statistics, the facts of the matter. The reality is, dear listeners, that on every indicator of social failure, we British Muslims are performing the worst. That's the reality. Let's start with prison. Prison is a major indicator of social failure. 5% of this country are Muslim. Do you know how many percentage of our prison population are Muslims? From that 5%, 14.4% of the population in prison are Muslim. That's a major, major failure. 20% of the population of prisons, that's how much it went up by over the last decade. The population of prison went up by 20%, but the rise in Muslim prisoners went up by 122%. And it's the same all over Europe. There is a major problem. And only a post-truth, post-fact liberal or lefty would ignore or pretend that there isn't a problem when you've got 5% of our country are Muslim, and yet in prison 14.4% of the prison population are Muslim. That cannot be good by any measure. That cannot be defined as success by any measure. Let's move to employment. Surprise, surprise. British Muslims are unemployed at a rate more than double of the general population. The general population's unemployment rate stands at 5.5%. British Muslims' unemployment in this country is at 12.8%. That cannot be defined as success by any measure. No liberal or no lefty can tell me that's a good thing. And so multiculturalism has failed Britain's Muslims first and foremost. Let's move to gender equality. Out of the 12.8% of unemployed in this country, 65% of them are Muslim women. So not only are Muslims disproportionately unemployed in this country, out of those disproportionately unemployed, 65% of them are British Muslim women. And that's not, by the way, because people don't want to employ them, because the same survey asked employers how many would be willing to employ British Muslim women, and 75% of them said they would. Multiculturalism is dead. There's a triple paralysis when it comes to women, because they suffer from both the stigma within their own communities for seeking independence, cultural stigma, and so there's a paralysis that is because they're Muslim, there's a paralysis because they're female, and there's a paralysis because they come from an ethnic minority community. That triple paralysis has led to what the Women's Inequalities Committee in the House of Parliament described British Muslim women as, quote, the most disadvantaged group in society. 35% of all Muslim women from the age of 16 to 64 are unemployed in this country, compared to the 69% of the employment rate among women in the general population. That cannot be defined as success by any measure. Let's move to education. Again, the lowest performing. 24% of British Muslims reached a qualification level 4 or above. That's lower than the general population and a lot lower than the rate within British Hindus, which stands at 45%, and British Sikhs at 30%. So when compared to other minority groups, it's a huge failure in education. And let's finally move to values. Liberal values with a small L. A 2016 ICM poll found that 52% of Britain's Muslims would ban homosexuality if they had a choice. And don't take it from me, because it's not just one survey. Let me give you some other surveys, and then you see a pattern beginning to emerge. A 2007 poll found that 36% of British Muslims said that apostates deserve to be killed. In fact, you heard one of them on my show call in just yesterday. He called himself Omar. 36% of British Muslims said apostates deserve to be killed. A 2008 YouGov poll surveying a British Muslim student opinion found 33% saying they supported a caliphate. A 2015 Comres poll, this is from last year, folks, after the Charlie Hebdo attacks in Paris, found that a whopping quarter of British Muslims expressed sympathy for the Charlie Hebdo attacks. A quarter of British Muslims in a 2015 Comres poll expressed sympathy for those brutal murderers who killed people who were working for a cartoon magazine. By what measure can the 90s Labour Party model of multiculturalism be deemed a success after you've heard all of that? Because every measure of failure in society, Muslims top the polls in failure. This is my people. This is my community. So when I speak about this, I speak from a place of love and disgust at the failures of government, and disgust at those so-called community leaders within our communities who are hiding these truths from the women of our communities, the minorities within the minorities, from the gay Muslims, from the ex-Muslims, from the liberal Muslims, from the feminist Muslims. The truth is being obfuscated and hidden by these Tim Pot community leaders who pretend to speak on everyone's behalf. Surprise, surprise, when there was a survey done on it, once again, giving you some facts, a dose of truth, when there was a survey done on it, the Muslim Council of Britain, guess what the percentage of Muslims in the UK said they refer to the Muslim Council of Britain for leadership? Only 2%. And so why does the Muslim Council of Britain have a stranglehold, a monopoly on British Muslim leadership when only 2% of Britain's Muslims said they see them as leaders? I'm not anyone's leader, by the way. I'm just a dude with a microphone. But the point is, at least I can tell you the truth and not be obscured, not be post-truth, not be post-fact, because of the way in which we have become, due to political correctness, to fear that we're going to be called racist if we speak in this way. The truth is, what's truly racist is failing British Muslims in this way. What's truly racist is sitting back while a disproportionate number of us are in prisons, are failing at education, are the most unemployed in this country, and our women are the ones who are the biggest sufferers of this stigma in the country overall from any disadvantaged group. It's truly racist not to want to do anything about that. And the problem has been that we've been celebrating differences and not commonality. The problem has been a bigotry of low expectations. Multiculturalism is dead. Long live omniculturalism. Long live integration. Long live people not fearing from fear of being called racist or Islamophobic or anti-Muslim bigots, from wanting to do something to uplift Muslim minorities in this country so that they're on par with everyone else. That's what equality means. And multiculturalism failed these communities. It's high time we had a policy that celebrated what we have in common rather than how we are different. And a policy that focused on integration instead of segregation.